was an underground circular structure. And it had 47 seats and then 3 other seats on top of a platform with an eagle's type of, unbelievable. And the seats were all carved out in red clay. Well, they reconstructed that now so that you can go in there. You can go in this underground thing and look around. And school kids do it all the time. Well, we always wondered, well, why did Etowah have an underground structure like that? It was the same time period. And somebody, well, I don't know, maybe they just did something different in Macon. 12 years ago, we found this over here, a big underground structure of some kind, huge, double the size of the one in Macon, 15 feet down in the ground, unbelievable stuff. And we began to do a little bit of work to try to figure it out. But good gosh, it's hard to excavate that thing. It's so big. And guess what? This past year, we found another one right up here. Not quite as big as this one, but there's another one. And those are all kind of aligned with, this is west, this is east. It's kind of an axis going on here of some kind. So we don't know. There's just more stuff to discover every day with this. And thank goodness we have these new technologies that we're working on there to do those things. I'm helping Georgia Tech right now. Long story. I don't have time to tell the whole story, but Georgia Tech has just voted this year, just this spring, to create a department of archaeology, the technologies of archaeology, to focus on that. There are 2 expert kind of organizations like that in Europe, but none in the United States. So that's what we're going to try to do at Georgia Tech, and maybe use part of what was going on up here as part of a laboratory for that. It's whole new technology, non-invasive techniques. And let me tell you, American Indians, Native American folks, they like that. They like it when you're going out there and doing things that are non-invasive. Because when you get invasive, then you get into burials and you get into all kinds of other, ceremonial issues that they don't really like. So they like the non-invasive stuff a lot, which is terrific. But I just wanted to show you a group of that. Again, this is that site where we found that big underground chamber. It's kind of here. This is the black and white version showing the magnetic pole. These long striped things here, those are irrigation lines for a sod farm. But it just shows you the metallic things that show up. Those big white dots, those are the sprinkler heads for the irrigation things. But not here. This is showing the big underground chambers that are here. That is a smaller site, and the black thing in the center, that's showing a hearth in the middle of that structure. So it depends on how you learn how to read these things. There's a close-up of that big structure with something that also looks like an eagle. How about that? With even an eye type of eagle, that was maybe a burned structure right in the middle of this eagle type thing. So fascinating stuff that we're learning more about every day and helps us. Okay, let's move forward to the 16th century. You had these big mound structures that were going on like that, these big elaborate earthworks, and then everything changed for some reason where they're not building. I call it urban sprawl. They just had these villages that the population was going up like a rocket still was during that whole period, 1200, 13, 1400, 1500 AD. Population's going up like crazy. Birth rates are up, infant mortality rates are down, and these villages start to pop up and down the rivers. And they don't have big mounds. They don't have any mounds at all in some cases. The villages hadn't been there very long. And so they ended up, though, with these walls on the outside of a village, a ditch here, an open plaza, a council house, homes inside of the walls. These are defensive structures, those kind of things along rivers. Yes, a whole bunch of those. And that's what you begin to see in that period, in that time period of 1500 or so AD. And the houses look like that, wattle and daub type structures with mud packed on the outside and cane on the roofs, those kinds of things. We know those really well. We find those archaeologically. When we find them archaeologically, they look like this. Now, these things are semi-subterranean, so they drop down about 3 or 4 feet down to the ground. That makes them warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer. The little entranceway, instead of on that last one that showed an entranceway kind of in the middle of the house, the entranceways are really over on the sides, on the corners of those houses. That's how you get in and out of the house. Well, if it's down under the ground like that, and the roof and the walls collapse when the house burns, which happened a lot, these things would burn kind of slowly, then you get all these baked walls and ceilings that are packed on top of these floors. Then you can have a cotton field on top of that for 100 years, and you'll never know that there's a village down underneath there or a house. But if you carefully go in there and figure that out and take those things away, then you've got a time capsule. You've got a house just the way it was the day it burned down. And that's what this is. This is near Rome, Georgia. This is west of Rome, about 20 miles, 15 miles or so. These are some of the posts that were on the walls of the outside of the village here. This is one of those houses. That's a fireplace in the center. Those are little benches type structures where they had beds. So the beds were on little benches and 7 or 8 people in the house. So when you peel all of this back, there's a pot over here, and you very carefully excavate the dirt that is inside the walls of that house. And you do it, a few centimeters at a time in little squares. And you take every bit of that dirt out and go down about 4 or 5 or 6 centimeters, take that dirt out, label every bit of it, put it in bags very carefully, take it back to a laboratory and run it through a water filtration process. We call it flotation, because what's floating to the surface are all the little burn things, all the little burn seeds, other types of particles that are carbonized, all kinds of little things like that. Scrape those off the top, dry them out, and then start counting them under a microscope. And you do that for an entire house, then all of a sudden you've got a really great picture of exactly what was going on in that house. We know that this work was done in 1973, and we were doing that kind of technology even then. We know that house burned down in October. Gosh, how do we know that? Well, found a big pile of seeds right over here. There were honey locust seeds. Well, honey locusts are harvested in October, and they were all piled up in one part of the house. They hadn't been scattered out yet. Honey locusts are you get a candy bar these days and it says guar gum or natural gums. That's what they're talking about. It's a gummy type substance in these big pods. Tastes wonderful. It's called a honey locust because of the sweetness of those pods. It's a dark looking stuff. It looks terrible, but it tastes great. And so that's what some of your natural candy bars, that's what they're using is honey locusts. So this is one of those villages from that we excavated in 1973. Well, we began to do some other work there, and then along came some looters when we were not around. This was before the laws that we passed in the 1990s to prohibit this kind of looting. And the looters came along and they dug up some burials, some human burials. Before they dug up these, though, actually, these were dug by an archaeologist who was at Shorter College. And this is when he first found this site. He went out there, and sometimes you get lucky, and he just came right down on this thing with the first test pit. Well, something strange about this site, about this burial. First of all, these two individuals are laid out flat. Most American Indian. Now, I've got to ask this question. If this offends anybody in this room that I'm showing these human burials, let me know that, and I will move on from this slide. If I hear any objection, I will do that. We try to be much more sensitive about showing these things these days, and I'm not showing any ceremonial objects of any kind from these on purpose. But having said that, I'm treating this very respectfully. This is a very important piece of information in this one burial. That's the reason I'm going to show this. First of all, there are 2 individuals here. Normally, when Native Americans die and were buried, they were buried in a flexed position. Usually when you die in a flexed position. If you've been sick, you kind of don't feel good, and that's the way you die, and that's usually the way that people were buried back in those days. These individuals are not. They're laid out flat, which is a little odd. And there are 2 people in the burial. That's odd. That's not typical. And then some other really strange things. This individual has a fracture in the skull. It's caused by a very sharp metal weapon right there to the head. When you looked at these other bones closely, there were defensive wounds on the arms and then wounds on the legs as well. No wounds, no bones that were damaged in the central part of the body. Well, when you look at European warfare sites from the 14th, 15th, 16th centuries, they look the same way, because how people are fighting is that they've got these metal weapons and they try to keep each other kind of at bay with these longer poles. And what they'll do then is take these halberds that have a big blade on the end of them, and they'll whack the legs out from under somebody, and then they'll hit them over the head with a sword. So you get wounds that are on the legs, you get defensive wounds on the arms, and you get death wounds on the head. That's the kind of wounds that these bodies exhibited. Very strange. And recognize this, in 1973, we had no clue where any of the Spanish expeditions had gone in Georgia. We had very little evidence of any of these things. We had a few sites, we had some records, we had some diary accounts, but nobody ever kind of figured it out. Nobody had put it together because we hadn't seen enough. We didn't know enough about these sites. We didn't even know how the pottery sequences fit together from this late time period. We really didn't have analyzed. We focused a lot on mound sites, but not on these sites that were out there up and down these rivers that were kind of scattered around. And just right after we left there, 2 looters came out there and found this sword on the same site. And when you look at the type of sword that is, it's a basket hilt rapier or basket hilt broadsword, is what that's called, made in the 16th century, early 16th century, in either northern Italy or southern Germany. And so there you go. You know, that came out of one of the Spanish expeditions. This thing led, this one site, King site, led to a new way of thinking about, okay, let's take a look at these Spanish sites. Let's take a look at these Spanish artifacts we're beginning to find, and let's look at these sites, other sites that are kind of like this one, weren't big mound sites, and take a look at the pattern of these sites and try to match those up to diary accounts from DeSoto diaries. And that's what began to happen. And what we begin to see are, again, this pattern of these sites. This is that same site where I showed you the house that I showed you that we had been excavated. That was right over here. The burial that I'm just talking about there, that was somewhere up in here. The sword was found over here. Okay, look, no mound, no mound. A chief structure here, some sort of ceremonial chief structure here, ceremonial structure here, open plaza. All of a sudden, we begin to see lots of these and recognize them. Wait a minute, these are clusters of sites. This is villages. This is a political system of these villages strung together. Beginning to figure that out. Then start to compare that to what DeSoto's talking about, the length of rides between these villages, where they were, those kinds of things. Begin to pull all of that together. A guy named Dr. Charles Hudson began to do that. I've got some sheets of paper that will tell you lots of resources of books to read and all those things I'll leave for you a little later. But we begin to study those things. And then all of these things begin to make some sense. And here we go, we look at the route of DeSoto. This is the route of DeSoto as Charles Hudson and Chester DePratter and Marvin Smith put together to show this route. And they went back and looked at every day in the diary, what was said in the diary, what was the length of time, the lengths of space, how far did they go, 3 leagues, what did a league mean, how far was that, and begin to string all of these together. I didn't show you the route, but 1939 was a 400-year anniversary commission to look at the route of DeSoto. Well, it was wrong. It showed the route coming up through here, and then it went a little bit sort of this way, and then it strung over there. A lot of weird, it went to weird places where, oh, there's a mound over here, maybe he went over there. But they didn't know the time periods for those particular mounds. Here we had a better handle on the ceramics and the time periods, and that's what these things match up to, are those time periods. And DeSoto went up left from here near Tallahassee, Florida, came up here near Macon, Georgia, right in here, went over to South Carolina, in this area, Coosawattee, all the way up into Tennessee, North Carolina, the mountains. DeSoto was not afraid of the mountains. That's where they found the gold in Peru, was in the mountains. Mountains. That's where you're going to find the mines. That's where you're going to find the gold. And then they got up in the mountains here. They kept hearing about this Coosa. They kept hearing about this large, powerful province up in here ever since they were down here in Tallahassee. That's where he wanted to go because he knew that's where the big population groups were. That's where the most powerful people were. He kept asking those questions over and over again. And that's where they ended up, was in here. And they came through Coosa by coming from the north and coming down into the south into this period. Coosa was here, right on the Coosawattee River. We didn't know that until we began to do this research and begin to figure it out and exactly where it was. This is where he came and then stayed for about a month and then sent out little pieces of soldiers in little groups every day for about a month, trying to find it. Is there gold here? If there's gold going to be anywhere, this is where it's got to be. Because we've heard about this place and we haven't found any gold yet. All along through here, this is where it's going to be. About in March of this past year, April this past year, folks at Bartow County asked me to do, I couldn't believe they asked me to do this. They wanted me to do an all-day, 7-hour seminar on the 16th century. And I went, oh my gosh, how am I going to talk that long? How am I going to keep everybody interested in what I'm talking about? So I said, well, I think I can go for 3 or 4 hours on stuff I already know, but I got to go dig up some more stuff. So I went back into a lot of research on some things that I had never heard before. Things about DeSoto's contract. The contract he had with Spain was over the top. It was, if he had achieved that contract, oh my gosh, he would have controlled all of the land between about Delaware and one of the cities on the coast of Mexico, and all the way west to almost the Mississippi River. That's the area he was given to control, to go after. He could go explore all that, do everything he wanted to do. He'd invest some of his own money that he'd accumulated in Peru He was a slave trader down there, by the way. He was a slave contractor, providing ships to to Pizarro in Peru with ships. So he assembled this money, went back to Spain and said, okay, now I'm going to have my own expedition. And so he put this all together. And here's the deal I want. Well, the deal was spectacular for him and for the deal was he got to keep about 20%. And the rest he had to cover the expenses of, and the crown got about 20%, and the church got about 5% of that whole thing. But here's the kicker. He only had 4 years. He had 4 years to pull this off. And it meant that he had to go in there, exploit everything that he could get. Ransom was a word they actually used in the contract, meaning he could go and kidnap these chiefs and hold them for ransom and get the gold. That was what it was all. It was in the contract, ransom and any other exploitation he wanted to do. It was all just go after it, man, go full for it. And then after the 4 years, whatever gold he had found of his own and been able to accumulate for himself, then he could take that gold and invest it in developing, like a developer, all of that land and carve it all up into like franchises, encomiendas, little places that were little places where he could subcontract other people. Oh, and for himself, he got 93,000 acres he would have for his own personal use. Oh, and he got to be governor of Cuba at the same time in advance, and governor of Florida too, which means he went to Cuba and accumulated all the soldiers and the pigs and everything else to go on the expedition, and just kind of looted Cuba too while he's on the way. So it was a fabulous deal if he could pull it off. So that's why he was under tremendous pressure. If he couldn't find the gold, if he couldn't do all that stuff, this thing was going to collapse. He was getting more desperate as he moved through this entire area, trying to figure out, okay, I think that's where the gold's going to be. And it wasn't there. Uh-oh. And here are all these other people. There were also people on the expedition putting their own personal money in the expedition, getting their gut, it was just crazy. They were getting their uncle's money and grandfather's money and investing their own and riding on the expedition too. Everybody wanted to go because, hey, they've been successful in Peru. This guy's going to do the same thing in this area, so let's go for it. So it was a big looting expedition is what it was all about. The colonizing would come later if he was able to pull it off money-wise. So that's what happened in here, in these areas in here. So that's what we're looking at. And these are key, these names are going to come back later. Chiaja, Coosa, Etowah. Etowah is Etowah. That's where Etowah got its name, Etowah. And then Mabila is where the terrible battle was that Tuscaloosa ambushed him, put some guys together and they ambushed, had this terrible battle. It's worse for the Indians than it was for DeSoto. I mean, we're talking about 3,000 or 4,000 indigenous people dying that day in one day in this horrible event. DeSoto lost about 100 people or a little less than that. But it was a terrible blow to the expedition. It was never the same after that. But what we're going to show is a few of these things in terms of what did this look like? What did this Coosa look like in terms of the reporting relationships with this chiefdom? And it was an area about like that. And we're, again, looking at the sites that are in there, comparing the ceramics, comparing what they're talking about in the diaries, all of those things. So this was a powerful chiefdom, an area. So this chief of Coosa had sway over this large area, but it was not one big monolithic area. It was broken up into small villages and clusters like this. So that Coosa itself on the Coosawattee River was about 7 or 8 villages like that. Chattanooga, that cluster right here, right where we are, with Moccasin Bend and 3 or 4 other sites that are right in here. Hiawassee cluster, this Chiaja cluster. These are all polities, we call those political units. They're all part of this larger chiefdom of Coosa, this paramount chiefdom. There's a little chiefdom here, a little chiefdom there, and then stringing those all together, we call a paramount chiefdom. And in every village had its own chief. And over these little clusters had a chief, and then the big chief over all of these all linked together. That's the kind of things that we began to figure out and link these together. So these are clusters that we've actually found archaeologically. Remember where the Great Smoky Fault is running through there. And look where those clusters land right there. The chiefdoms land right on that Great Smoky Fault at the same time. So look at those, and this is another way of looking at those. We're going to zoom in closer and closer on some of these sites and some where they are and what they all kind of mean. And these, again, were the ones that I focused on when I was in high school. I was following these guys around. I was asking these farmers and other people about these sites, and I would go find these ceramics We still didn't know how they all fit together. And I was taking them out, taking the surface collections only, taking them home, washing the ceramics, and then figuring out how to classify these things. And we began to figure that out. That's how we began to figure out these clusters before we even figured out the entire route. Same with these down here at Etowah. I wasn't working on those then. We've worked on those a little bit a few years later. And these down here in Coosa. This is where that site was where the sword was found. It's right over here on this cluster of villages here. And then if we look at the Little Egypt site itself, is on Lower Carter Lake. This is the capital where Coosa actually existed. Let me back it up one slide and show you where that is. That's right there at the base of Carter's Dam, Carter's Lake, right here. It's called Little Egypt, and that was named that from the 1800s because it flooded every year. And when it flooded beautifully rich soils from down out of the mountains into that valley. Carter's Dam and Carter's Lake. Carter's Dam is the dam that Deliverance was really written about. And it was the Coosawattee River, this upper part of the Coosawattee was the really tough, dangerous strait for canoeing, and still is, although a lot of it's under the lake now, but it's still a really tough area. I've talked to canoers, they've been there. The movie was made over in Northeast Georgia on the Chattooga River, but it was in here that it was really written about. So the building of that dam was the subject of that movie. So the Little Egypt site, I mean, I got to tell you, the soil, we did some testing of the soil in there. The topsoil was 35 feet deep. And it was, you know, we're talking about 10, 12, 15,000 years old of soils. We went in there on the second week of June to do an archaeological work with field school. And we cut all the weeds down, small mounds that were there, a couple other things, cut all the weeds down. By the first week of August, the weeds were up 12, 15 feet high. I mean, it was unbelievable. There are yield records still on those sites in there with no fertilizers, you know, from the 1800s. We're talking about yield records of oats. And there used to be an old expression down there, wow, that guy's got more money than Carter has oats. Well, that's what they were talking about. You know, with the oats and the grains and the things that were yield records in there below Carter's Lake. So it was a spectacular area. This is what it looks like from the top of the dam looking down. It's the junction of the Coosawattee River coming out here, flowing west, and Talking Rock Creek coming in there from there. And right at the junction of those two places is where these mounds were, where DeSoto came. Wow, I show this slide sometimes to prove to my children that I used to have hair. That is me in 1972, you know, working on one of these things and taking out these little squares that we're going to then analyze in the, you know, in the laboratories in the hot sun. But that was that area there at Coosa. That was that area right there at Coosa. And so when you look at that again, and these are some of the sites there, again, Little Egypt here, Swansea site here, Port site, we're going to talk about a lot in a few minutes, Thompson site, Baxter, a bigger one here that actually is older. It goes back into the Etowah time periods a little bit too, in this Brown Farm site down here. I worked for several years to try to preserve all of these. I ended up buying two of these myself, this site here and this site here. I sold this one to the Archaeological Conservancy from New Mexico and did an archaeological easement on another piece right next to it here. I'm the only person in Georgia that's ever constructed an archaeological easement. And then I did a second archaeological easement just this past year on this site here that the University of Georgia owned, and it's now been turned over to somebody else. I own another piece of property over here next to this site that I bought to preserve. So I've worked with people for a long period of time to get these sites in the right hands, to get the farmers to not let the looters come in there anymore and dig up the things that were there, you know, all of those kinds of things that we've been able to see on these different sites. The DeSoto, this is when DeSoto came in. Okay, this is when DeSoto came through to that same area. This is the DeSoto arriving at Coosa. You see these indigenous people carrying the chief of Coosa on a white litter and covered in white feathers. That we know that from the diary accounts. I mean, this is truly like Martians meeting Earthlings, you know, and people, both groups looking at each other going, who are these people? You know, DeSoto's thinking the same thing. There are 5 diary accounts of DeSoto's. Only a couple of those are really kind of accurate. Some of them are not, but all of them are specific about the arrival at Coosa. It was that big a deal. It was that big a deal that everybody got the details right about what happened at the arrival of DeSoto at Coosa. There are principal men out here. These are only people. The chief was not allowed to have his feet ever touch the ground. So he lived up on top of a small mound. When he came down to associate with people off of the mound, he was carried around on this litter. His feet weren't supposed to touch the ground. And only other principal people could come close to him. And out in front are these people who are blowing horns and wearing marten skins or maybe even skunks. They were fragrant. We don't know quite what that means, but that's what was going on here when DeSoto arrived at Coosa. This is that same site. That's right there, below the big dam, and probably right where that scene happened. The river coming here. This is 1973, before they filled up this lower lake. Two lakes are there, one the upper lake and the other a lower lake that is here in that same area. Some artifacts that came from the same area: Clarksdale bells. Those are bells that the horses had on them, and dogs. And the Spanish would use those in some ways to terrify the Indians. Also, so they could hear the dogs when they had the dogs out in the wood. The dogs were meant to attack the Indians, hold them at bay, do things with them. It was terrible ways that they even tortured them with these animals, with the dogs. And then a couple of other sites. I'm going to show you the one right below that, the Swansea, the Porch Arms site. That's the large one there. We're going to come back to that in a minute. I think this was an aggregation site. It's a very, very large site. This is the site right there, that one that says Porch right there. Very large site, both sides of the river, very, very large. And I think that as the societies began to break down after DeSoto came through, this site became bigger. People were dying. They were coming closer together. It's like an apocalyptic movie where people are starting to die. They're starving to death. They're looking for friends. They're gathering themselves together in bigger sites. And I think that's what happened here at this Porch Farm site. I think that was where this site, what the site was all about. Some trade beads that were found also at this Porch Farm site. Those are called Nueva Cadiz beads here, chevron beads. This is a little blown glass bead that matches one that was from the DeSoto's winter headquarters in Tallahassee. This is a Nueva Cadiz bead here, and these are little pieces of copper wire strung together. Some iron objects that match other DeSoto sites, long spikes. These might be the broken tips off of halberds, those big blade type things. They had a spike that went up in the air. They might have broken those off. This is the handle from a knife or a blade of some kind up there. The tip off of a crossbow bolt, also there from the same site. And it was found in a cluster with these, a projectile point cache. These were 125 of these in one cache with the crossbow bolt, with the Spanish arrow tip in there in the same cache. Remarkably made, remarkably finely made. I cannot tell you how beautiful those things were. The guy handed me a box of them, and my hands were shaking, and they were tinkling like glass. I mean, they were that finely made. They were beautiful things. And guess what? They're identical to these that were found up here, the Citico site. Same kinds of blades, almost identical in the way that they're manufactured. Some are a little more pointed on the ends, some are a little more leaf-like, but they're all from that same kind of thread. These maybe represent kind of individuals. This is not a single person who made these. And we know that because we did a lot of work on these. So look at these. These were all made by different people. Let me tell you something interesting about these. In every village, there was a white chief and a red chief in every village. The white chief was born into that position of power. The red chief achieved their position of power, kind of like a military chief. In this whole cache of 125 points, one white blade and one red blade. How about that? So, I mean, we think these were all laid into this. Perhaps it was a grave. These were all dug up by a looter, but laid in there as tribute to someone who died by the individuals who had these different points. I'm not showing you the worst ones. There were even some crudely made ones. Maybe they were made by kids, but there were a few at the end who were crudely made. So these beautiful fine ones, and then a few that were not so fine. So they were not made by one individual. These were made by lots of different individuals. But again, these other blades that came from Citico side and Hampton Place. So these are from up here too, all part of the same system, part of that same group. Further downriver, this is the Thompson site, one of the ones that I bought. It was a ceremonial site. It has a small mound. We did lots of excavation work there. University of Georgia's come there with multiple field schools. Other Kennesaw College, University in Marietta has been there as well. Dr. John Worth, one of the top researchers in the Southeastern in the country in this time period. I had him hired for me for 2 or 3 years. He's now down at the University of West Florida, where he's discovered another big, very important village down there, earlier than St. Augustine. And everybody said, oh, St. Augustine was the earliest. Yes, until John Worth figured out there's another site there that was settled in 1560 and 1561, about 5 or 6 years earlier than St. Augustine, right at Pensacola, in Pensacola Bay. John's a wonderful guy, a brilliant researcher as well. These are teaching school kids. We've taught 20,000 school kids and parents and adults over about a 3 or 4 year period. We were the largest educational organization in the country during that period, doing that kind of educational work. And we really enjoyed doing that. I got to tell you, and this is the looting that went on before we passed these new laws. This is at that Baxter site. That was the big Etowah type of time period site that also had a later component from 16th century. Those are cars, trucks. These guys made that little road coming down in there. And those are all looter holes, all done over about a 90-day period. And I won't show you the close-ups of some of the burials that were destroyed during that whole period. But that's when we went to work and created these new laws in Georgia to outlaw that kind of thing. And we did a great job. We took little pieces of laws from South Carolina, from Tennessee, from Alabama, and put those all together in comprehensive legislation that I don't have time to describe to you, but I'm telling you, it's helped tremendously. We don't have that kind of looting anymore. And we've worked with the landowners to keep that from happening too. Brown Farm site further downriver. I own this land over here. It's a couple 100 acres. And then I help preserve this piece out in here. That's my neighbor, and we're doing work out there. A Spanish horseshoe from that site out there as well. And some pipes. These are very unusual. These are, this is called a monolithic axe pipe, but it's got the mouth of a rattlesnake, essentially is what that represents. This is a bird eating an egg. This is the egg. This is the mouth of the bird. This is another bird over here. Oh, the snake eating an egg. And this is the birds over here angry at the snake in that whole thing from that Brown Farm site. And guess what? These pipes look a whole lot like these C.B. Moore excavations that were done at Hampton Place. Pipes are very, very similar. There are a couple of others from the other side down there. So they're all from that same, again, these are people associated with each other from these same sites. I want to move really quickly to a couple other things about this. This route of DeSoto, you remember. Okay, well, guess what? 50 years later, 30 years later, 20 years later, here comes the Tristan da Luna expedition. This is where John Worth was doing his work down here in Pensacola Bay. This expedition started in Mexico City. It was a colonizing expedition, not a gold-seeking expedition. 1,500 people leaving Mexico on, 15 ships, 100 people on each ship, coming to found a colony up here. And they were going to come all the way back up here to Coosa to put this colony in. Well, all their ships got destroyed in a hurricane before they could unload the ships. It was in August of the year, during hurricane season. They all got destroyed in the hurricane here. They moved the expedition up into here as best they could. And then they took about 125 people and they went all the way back up to Coosa to try to figure out what to do. Did they shake the whole expedition, keep going up here? De Luna, that's another wild story about him. He was in trouble financially. He had creditors in Mexico after him, but he had to make this. So he had to make this expedition work. They followed him to the docks in Mexico City and filed suit on him while he was leaving, trying to get money from him. And, I got to get out of here. I got to make this expedition work. So then he gets here and the ships get destroyed. Oh my gosh. Some of the guys in bad shape. And so all these people were going to sue him. The other people on the expedition were all going to sue him. So they kept really good records of everything that happened in the expedition. The Spanish were great on records, especially when there was going to be a lawsuit involved. So there's just remarkable volumes of letters and documents about what was going on in this expedition. So they come all the way back up to Coosa, and we're going to figure out what to do. They get up here and they find food, and they sent the food back down they were starving to death. And the Indians here helped. And I haven't told you all the details of what the terrible things DeSoto did to the chief of Coosa and kidnapping the chief and his daughter and all that stuff I hadn't had a chance to tell you, but that's what happened. And yet these people come back from Mexico City and the people of Coosa are still being nice to them. And they're helping them out. They were starving to death and they're trying to help them out. And they send food all the way back to the rest of the expedition here. But something remarkable happened here where Chattanooga comes into play. After they'd been there about 2 or 3 weeks and helping them out, the local Indians and Native Americans were helping them. The Native Americans said to them, okay, listen, we've helped you, but we need a little help now. And most of this was a little military group. there was a chief, a couple of priests on this as part of this expedition. They said, well, what do you want? Well, see our other parts of our territory that we all know about, right? Who are these other little polities up in here? They haven't been paying their tribute the way they're supposed to be paying their tribute. Now, see, we're learning from that the breakdown is already starting to happen. It's only been 20 years since the DeSoto expedition. People are starting to starve. The expedition, certainly these polities are starting to break down politically. Birth rates are going down. Infant mortality is going up. They're starting to lose control over some of these other areas. And that's what they're saying. Hey, this group up here, these Napoches, they're not paying their tribute. They're not doing what they're supposed to do. Can you go help? Can you help us go up there and have a little military action on them? A little discussion with them. And the military guy says, okay, all right, that's great. Yeah, we'll be glad to help you. The priest went, whoa, I'm going too. I don't like this idea. The priest was a terrific guy. There's a lot of information about him. Domingo de la Anunciacion. And there's big biographies on him in Mexico. He spoke many languages. That's the reason he was on this expedition. He said, well, I'm going too, just to check on things. Well, the expedition is remarkable in its detail. They got ready to go on the expedition, the morning of the expedition. They all get out there and they're all getting all hyped up and ready to go. And somebody said, I'm talking about the Native American groups here, people. Well, okay, who's got the food? Well, you were supposed to get the food. No, you were supposed to get. So they had this nasty fight, among themselves about who was supposed to get all the supplies together. Okay, well, they had their bows and arrows all ready to go, but they didn't have any food. So the expedition was delayed another hour or two while they got their food together. And then they start off. Well, you remember the thing about the chief being carried on a litter? Okay, well, here it is 20 years later. Things are breaking down a little bit. Well, they really didn't have enough people to carry the guy on the litter. So they put him on their backs, like piggyback. They were carrying the chief piggyback, and that guy get tired. They put him on somebody else's back. And so I don't know, after about 3 or 4 times, he said, you got to walk. So the chief had to walk like everybody else. But I mean, these are the things, these are little details. So we're starting to learn what is changing culturally. And so they get up here. Again, I can't tell. It's an hour lecture on this thing alone. But they get up here to the river, and we think it's the Tennessee River. It's a big, wide river. The village that they're coming to is abandoned. Okay, well, there's one poor sick guy in the village, and they go over and they find this poor sick guy, and the Indians are going to kill him, and the priest is pulling them back. No, you can't do that, and let's baptize the guy first, and they do that, and then the guy dies anyway. And so then they're, well, what happened to the rest of the people? Well, they're over there across the river making fun of us. They're over there taunting us. We can't have that, and they haven't given us any respect, and now they're taunting us. So the Spanish fired some gun over there. They only had one gun, and they fired it. And it terrified the Indians. They all laid down on the banks, and they went over there and captured them. They captured all these folks. And again, they're going to kill them. And the priest goes, no, we can't. Let's don't do that. Let's discuss this out. So the priest helps them have a negotiated settlement. And the negotiated settlement, we learned from the negotiated settlements a lot of things too. Okay, so what are you going to do? Well, you got to pay your tribute. You need to pay your tribute like you're supposed to. Okay, and so you begin to see what the tribute is, and you think, well, it's bushels and bushels of corn, right? No, it was more like gourmet stuff. We want certain kinds of chestnuts, and we want certain kinds of hickory nuts, and we want certain kinds of honey. It was all these specialty goods. That's what they wanted as the tribute. Things that were a little more special. It was like going down to the cheese shop, and kind of raiding the cheese with all the fancy stuff. That's what they wanted, and they saw as tribute, which is fantastic. That it wasn't, big bushels and bushels of corn. It wasn't that at all. So we learned a lot of things out of it. So out of that negotiated settlement, everything's fine. Nobody got killed. Nobody else got killed. They all went back over to Coosa, and then the Spanish packed up and they went back to Nanipacana. They went all the way back down to here. The expedition went back to Ochuse down here, and then they went back to Mexico City. But all of this, and now I've got to tell this one more thing. I know I've only got 2 more minutes left, but I'm going to tell you this part of the story too, because I think it's a really important one. Right up here at that Porch Farm site, where I think that aggregation point, I think that's where they left from on that expedition to go to do the Napoche thing, to have the Napoche thing. Well, there's the site again, big site there. And on this site, I get a call from this guy, and this is 1986, I guess. And he has a bait shop in Calhoun, Georgia, and he's this old crusty guy, hey, they found something up here that's made of copper. And you got to see this thing, blah, blah, blah. He said, well, I have a drawing of it. I said, okay, great. Well, he faxes me this drawing. And I said, well, where? And I said, good gosh, what is this? What is this? It's some kind of animal. What is this? And of course, he's trying to say, well, this is some sort of penis thing here on this character. And I'm going, I don't know about that, but okay, let's keep investigating whatever this is. And I said, well, where is this thing? And I said, how big is this? Well, it's about, 6, 7 inches wide and 4 or 5 inches. And this is engraved in copper. And I said, where is it now? He said, well, somebody's traded something for it. Or the guy paid $300 or $400 for it. It's over in South Carolina somewhere. Well, who is that guy? And so the guy gives me a phone number, and a name. All right, well, I'll call this guy up. So I call this guy up, and this guy says, yeah, I got this thing. It's a piece of copper. It's still got mud and dirt all over. And I said, well, that's a good thing. Don't try to take any more mud and dirt off of it. He said, that's the drawing. That's the best I can get out of it right now. I said, well, it doesn't look like anything Spanish to me, and it doesn't look like anything Native American to me, but I'd like to see it in person. He said, okay, next time I'm in Atlanta, I'll bring it down there and you can look at it. Sounds great. 3 days later, it showed up in the mail. He mailed it to me, packed up in this thing. Oh my gosh. Okay, what do I do now? So I started doing everything. I started calling everybody. Smithsonian. I called lots of people. What do I do about this dirt? What do I not do? Do I take the dirt off? Do I do this? I heard every opinion. And these are from conservators. I heard everything from don't touch it to use acid on it. I mean, and everything in between. Okay, so I decided to go for, okay, I'm going to take the dirt off under a microscope, centimeter by centimeter, as best I can, under the microscope with only a little bit of distilled water. That's all I'm going to do. I spent 4 months doing that, working that under a microscope. And this is what it looked like before, when the dirt was still on it. And as I figured out, this thing in the middle was a hole. There was a hole here and a little hole here that had been pulled out. So it'd been a gorget that had hung around like the neck. There were 2 little nail holes on either side here. Some other decorations out here. Okay, and broken up in these other pieces. So then we did X-rays. I did infrared, ultraviolet work, all kinds of other stuff. And this is what it looked like cleaned up. Okay, that looks okay. And then if you get a drawing of that under a microscope, it looks like that. Okay, so I had this little piece of paper, and it only had this little piece of paper for about a week. And I went to a conference in Macon, Georgia. It was the 50th anniversary of the work that had been done at Smoky Mountain. And a guy named Jesse Jennings was there from Utah, 86 or 87 years old. And a guy, Jimmy, I'll think of his name in a minute, who was at the Smithsonian for many, many years. And I was at lunch with him, and I passed this piece of paper around. And everybody around the table was, whoa, I don't know what that is. I don't know what that is. Jesse Jennings went, I know exactly what that is. That is right out of the Florentine Codex out of Mexico City from the mid 1500s. Wow, really? Yeah, and that is right, the Sahagún text. Whoa, who is that? Well, he was a priest in Mexico, and he spent 50 years of his life documenting Mexican life, Aztec life, and getting everything done in English and in Nahuatl and in Spanish. And these characters are just like what you'll see from that Nahuatl text. Okay, all right. All right, I'm going to shorten the story because this is another 2-hour lecture. I'm going to give you the 1-minute version, okay? This is a female character. This is called a huipili, this type of skirt here. This skirt here with this neck stamp design, a border at the bottom. These are flowers or lilies over her shoulder. This is a male figure with a cloak knotted at the neck. He is holding a flower. I thought it was a torch, but it's a flower, like a rose. Okay, in Aztec life, this is giving instruction. This is receiving instruction. That's what those hand things mean. This is an animal that's probably an ox. Downturned horn, neck folds here, cloven hoof. Every mark on here means something. Every single mark on here was not a stray mark. It was intentionally cut over and over and over again with a stone obsidian tool. So there's no stray marks here, even this piece right here. I'll tell you about it. This is the announcement of the birth of Christ to Mary by the angel Gabriel, done in Aztec clothing styles. So this is an Aztec Indian in Mexico with Christian religious training who is trying to show a design that he has seen somewhere else. You go to every church in Europe, at least in France and Spain and Portugal, and in the older churches, you'll see an annunciation scene. The announcement, you'll see all the other scenes of Christ too, but the announcement of the birth of Christ of Mary is one of the key ones. And this is what this is. The angel is almost always over here on the left, Mary's in the middle. This is an odd one, but it has very significant significance of this. In the Bible, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the 4 big apostles, are usually represented by animals. The animal of the ox is what Luke represents. Luke is represented by an ox. The announcement of the birth of Christ is told in the book of Luke. And one of the things that Luke says to Mary is, you are the handmaiden of the Lord, and you are going to receive this child. This little odd thing right there, out of the Sahagun text, I figured out all these other things, such as that cloak is knotted at the neck. In Aztec life, the knotted is usually on the back of the neck. It's only allowed to be in the front if you're a messenger or somebody else of principal rank. So that knot is in the center on purpose, moved to the throat on purpose. This represents a torn and mended skirt, a skirt that has been torn and mended back. That is usually represented by women who go into the marketplace, even today in Mexico, and to be better negotiators, they'll wear their torn skirts, to look more downtrodden. That's what this is representing. She is represented as the handmaiden of the Lord. That's what that means. And that's what that story is being told there. So this is Gabriel telling Mary, you are to have this child. She is receiving that instruction. These are the lilies over the shoulder. That represents also the tree of life, or the tree of Jesse. And in the Old Testament, out of the lineage of Jesse, Jesus will come. That's what that means. And that's what that represents. So there is that figure that I just showed, a little bit of a close-up of it, or what it looks like under the microscope. And this is what, guess what? That's one of the drawings out of the Sahagun text. Looks just like that character. But that cloak is knotted on the back of the neck, because he's not a messenger. He's a gold worker in this sense. Almost identical out of this Florentine Codex from that same time period. A French Bible book cover from 1500, same kind of thing, copper. It was usually overlaid with manganese and then polished, but same kind of thing with the holes to attach it. So we think this is the cover to a Bible that was attached to the cover and then taken off and given to someone there on this site, and it was adapted then as a gorget around the neck. And that's how we ended up with that Coosawattee plate. Again, I've got some things about this. After this breakdown, I've got to move fast here because I want to open this up for questions from you. This post-chiefdom breakdown, 1600, 1650, population started moving around. Northwest Georgia, all these people we've been talking about left Northwest Georgia, left this part of Tennessee, and moved downriver into what we would call Alabama today, leaving a vacuum in here. Nobody was here in this area for a while. And about 1700 or so, you begin to see other kind of people moving into that area. That's where the Cherokees come into play. So that's how the Cherokees got. So these people that were here were Muskogean-speaking people, Creek people. When they left, when they abandoned this area then was populated by Cherokee people coming into the same area with other people moving. Lots of movement starting to happen. Remember, these are refugee groups starving to death, looking for friends, like a B movie of an apocalyptic nature. Same thing going on. And then this total chaos. I couldn't even put enough green in there to show you all the arrows, but it's just so much movement between 1700 and 1735. Just crazy, crazy movement going on and on and on. And that leads us to what happened then by 1800, 1750, 1800. And that's when the Cherokees then were, of course, headquartered here in Northwest Georgia. They moved into this area because it had been abandoned by the Creeks and the Creek-speaking people of Coosa. And what does Coosawattee mean? We should have known that. It means in Cherokee, old place of Coosa. The Cherokee knew that that's what the Coosa people had been. They knew who they were, and they knew that's where they had been. So we should have been paying attention to the names of these things at the same time. Okay, so there you go. Now, I want to open it up for questions that you've got to have. I know I've gone over a few minutes more than I should have, but I want to leave this open for you for questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Jim.
Sure.
If anyone is crunched for time and needs to leave, can you please exit out the top of the theater if that's convenient for you? And otherwise, we'll open it up for questions. I would ask that you try to speak loudly, and Jim, if you don't mind, to summarize the question so that everyone can hear what the question was.
Okay.
I'm going to go up and check and see if we got any questions on Zoom. So
Okay.
it's kind of bright down here, so
Yeah, I'm having.
raise your hands. Pretty.
Yeah, I see
okay.
one right over here. Yes. Yes, you. Yes, sir. That's very interesting. Somebody was going to call me over the past couple of days to ask me about DeSoto Falls. And it wasn't you, but it was a guy over in Northeast Georgia that my sister called me and said, what do you know about DeSoto Falls? This was 2 nights ago. Okay. And so I haven't looked at, all I know is DeSoto Falls was named DeSoto Falls, no, not going way back. It was fairly recently. It was in the past, I think the past 75 years or so that it was actually named DeSoto Falls. There's been a lot of, since the 1939 commission that was trying to show the route of DeSoto, people came up with all kinds of things. Oh yeah, DeSoto was here. We know DeSoto was here. There are plaques, they're then historical markers, even in Franklin, North Carolina, and a couple of other places that say, oh yeah, this is where DeSoto came from. Well, they're wrong. You know, those are just wrong. But don't tell people in Franklin, North Carolina that. They want to fight over it. You know, they're going to fight you over that. No. Okay. So DeSoto Falls, I think, is part of that, you know, where they said, okay, we think DeSoto was in here. We know he was up in this area. So we're going to name this DeSoto Falls. I mean, I think that's probably where the name came from. But the question that the guy wanted to know in Northeast Georgia was, what was it named before that? And so I've still got to do that piece of research. If anybody's got some information on that, I'll appreciate that. So there you go.
How big was DeSoto's contingency or whatever you call it?
He had about 700 people, 650 people. That's what he left with. He had a herd of 650 pigs at the same time. That's where all of that's where all the wild pigs come from that now populate the Southeast. Most of them, they got loose from the expedition. They were the emergency food supply. And so the question was, okay, well, how fast could this expedition go through the Southeast? Well, the answer is only as fast as the pigs could walk, you know. But usually the pigs were bringing up the rear. They had some guys kind of bringing the pigs along at the same time, and they had other people on horses going faster, you know, out in front at the same time. But about 625, 650 people. Got names for a lot of them. There are great service records in Spain on these people who were soldiers. Remember, some of these people were private individuals investing their own money. Some contingent were soldiers that DeSoto had hired and that he was supposed to pay for. You know, some of the military people that were there. But it was quite an interesting entourage of people. And there are service records for people who went back to Spain later and they wanted some compensation and they had to write up what they had done. We're still discovering those. John Worth, who I showed you the picture of, John was going to go to Spain and look in some of these records. And everybody went, no, you're not going to find anything new. There's not, you know, it's already been found by all the treasure hunters and everybody else. You're not going to find anything new. He went into the archives and in his first 60 days, he found 10,000 pages of material nobody had seen, you know, in 400 years. And part of what he found, and John's a brilliant guy, and he translated all of it and wrote it all up in books and stuff. And so one of the things that he found, this is off of your question, but he went in there and he was, for some reason, he was looking at 18th century stuff. I don't know why he was in there, but he was in the 18th century looking at these archives and he saw some darker pages of stuff. What is that? You know, he goes and pulls it up. It was all 16th century stuff stuck in an archive that was 200 years later. And what he found out was that when Oglethorpe landed in Georgia and started claiming all this land for, you know, for England down in this area of the coast of Georgia, the King of Spain went, wait a minute, we've owned that. How long have we owned that land? We've owned that land for 200 years, you know. Somebody go down there and do some research on it. So somebody went down there and pulled this whole research report together and then stuck it in the 18th century. And that's what John found, was all that material. So John has found a way to rewrite the history of the coast of Georgia that way. And there's some great stories out of that. That's a long answer to your question. Yes.
So, you know, because you've got Alabama next.
Yes.
Delineation between.
Yes. Yes.
So like, have the Creek.
Yes.
Muskogee.
That's right. Muskogee people, Muskogean speaking people. Well, they are over there, but the outlining here is showing the official territory of the Cherokee as defined by the state of Georgia. That's why I've driven that. That's why I have this laid out here. And all of this land was then surveyed in 1832, when the state of Georgia said, whoa, 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 we're gonna run these people out of here. Okay, we'll give them compensation for that. But we're gonna survey it all out into 60 acre and 80 acre to 160 acre lots. And then we're gonna have a big lottery to give this land away, to sell this land. And they did some of the same kind of things over in Alabama, but we're not showing that. I'm not showing the Alabama piece of it. Yes, Cherokees were over in Alabama. They were up here, of course, we know, in Tennessee. You know, different states had different ways of dealing with them. But the last holdout of the Cherokees was here in Northwest Georgia. And that, the creeks, a lot of the creeks moved into further south in Alabama. So they were moving downriver. So they're moving down the Alabama River, down into here. And they left, and there were multiple trails of tears. One of the trails of tears was the big one in 1838, 1839, leaving this part of Northwest Georgia, rounding them all up, taking them down to Ross's Landing down here, and then going, from here. That was the big one. But there were before that. There were creeks that left. There was a treaty down here further south with the creeks, where they then left earlier than that. Some Cherokees left earlier than that. So there were about 4 or 5 different trails of tier events moving further west.
Okay, folks, I'm sure there are more questions, but let's go ahead and adjourn to the lobby.
Okay,
Jim
I'm
will
going to
be
answer
around
this
for a
one
few
question for this guy
minutes.
right here. Okay, yes. Yes. That is mapped because of historical records. Historical records of a lot of the settlers and settlement pieces and all of these different towns. A lot of these individual towns are actually named. There are lots of historical records from the settlers, from the Indians themselves, from lots and lots of historical accounts that we know about these movements that went on and on and on, and how they moved around. But it was a real mess. And some of this was related to the slave trade. And I mean British paying Creek Indians or Cherokee Indians to go after their own people and put them in chains. I mean, that's what kind of crazy mess was going on. There was every kind of chaos that you could possibly imagine.